You're listening to Murder Not Murdering with Erin,
And Autumn,
a true crime podcast about murder and murdering.
but we are not murderers.
Bonjour. It is another wine and crime time with me, Erin. Autumn unfortunately can't be here, so I'm going to be telling you about a case that has everything. The most expensive wine in the world, blackmail, manipulation, and it all takes place in France. My co-star tonight will be a wine from the Chateau Neuf de Pas, because I cannot begin to afford the wine from this very story. It is similar, though, as that it does come from a specific area. This one is from the Rhone Valley in France. It is a medium-bodied red wine. It is known for its complex flavor and considered one of the most prestigious of the French wines. I will be enjoying a glass or two during this recording because I don't want to slur my words when I'm trying to say things in French. I also want to apologize to the French people for my pronunciations. And I promise I'm going to try not to be channeling the French chef in Little Mermaid or Lumiere from Beauty and the Beast. A side note, one of my favorite French movies, if you are wondering, which I don't know why you would be, but here it is, Amélie. I recently rewatched it and I love that movie so much and I forgot. The music makes me feel nostalgic right away. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. It will make you smile and feel something good about what's going on in the world right now. Anyway, now that I've been sentimental, let's get started. I know you're asking yourself, what could be the most expensive wine in the world? Well, it is Daumont de Romanée-Conti. Their 1945 Grand Cru sold for the sum of $558,000 in 2018. Only 600 bottles of this vintage were made. The wine is a Burgundy hailing from Daumont Romanée-Conti in France, and its staggering price comes from the exceptional circumstances under which it was made. Robert Slay, one of Sotheby's leading wine experts, said Romanée-Conti is hands down the best and rarest Burgundy in the world, the Holy Grail. Those are some big shoes. The legendary vineyard is on a small plot of soil just over 4 acres, and it produces roughly 500 cases annually. The average price for a single bottle, excluding taxes and buyer premium, is usually around $6,400. So definitely out of my price range for recording this very podcast. I did look into getting a bottle. I thought, oh, that'd be fun to get a bottle from the vineyard of which I'm telling the story. And yeah, that was a hard no for me. So I will enjoy my very delicious Chateau Neuf de Pas. It's about $50 at the grocery store, and it is delicious. I highly recommend. Anyway, this vineyard has a very extensive history, so I'm going to tell you a quick and shortened version of it. It began in 1232, many centuries old. It was acquired by the Abbey of Saint-Vivant, and in 1631, it was bought by the Kruenberg family, who renamed it Romanée. In 1760, André de Kruenberg decided to sell the Daumont, and it became the subject of a bidding war between Madame de Pompadour, famed mistress of Louis XV, and her bitter enemy, Louis Francois, Prince of Conti. The prince won, paying a massive sum of 8,000 livres, and the vineyard became known as Romanée-Conti. But then came the revolution, and the prince's land was seized and auctioned off. It exchanged hands a few more times, and in 1869 it was bought by Jacques-Marie de Vult-Blocher, who went on to build the Daumont that we know today. The current owners are Aubert de Villaine and Henri Frédéric Roche. Now, I mentioned a plot to bring down this historic vineyard, and it is a wild story. At a late hour in January 2010, a man snuck onto the vineyard, takes out a drill and a syringe filled with green liquid, then drills into the foot of the vines and plunges the syringe, injecting it with Roundup plant killer. He then moves to a neighboring vine less than a yard away and does the same. The man collects his drill, syringe, turns off his headlamp, and makes his way back up the hill and disappears into the trees. Word of the attack on the vines of Romane Conti going public would be disastrous, especially considering that this might inspire other criminals. Wine and poison are not words that usually go together, and it is described as very un-French, as wine is sacred. Not long after, owner Aubert found himself reading an unsigned note informing him that the Domaine de Romane Conti must prepare to pay a ransom for all the vines that would be destroyed. This was delivered to his private residence. A similar package arrived at the home of Henri, his partner. The package was a cylindrical container, and inside was a large parchment. Unrolled, the document was a detailed drawing of Romane Conti. While the 4-acre vineyard is essentially a rectangle, there are key points to its shape. So whoever sent this letter and sketched the vineyard knew every part of it. And in even more detail, the author noted every single one of its roughly 20,000 vine stalks. In the center of the vineyard sketch, this person or persons had drawn a circle. The note said that the vineyard would be destroyed unless certain demands were met, and then another letter with further instructions would be coming in the next 10 to 15 days. At first, Aubert viewed the letter as maybe a hoax, some kind of sick joke. He didn't want to believe that it was real. Then in mid-January 2010, he received another package at his home, as the sender said that it would. This was the same type of cylindrical container, and inside was the sketch of the vineyard. Only this time, there were 2 circles close to each other with X's in them, and then there was another smaller circle up in the upper left corner. They instructed Aubert to leave 1 million euros in a bag in the corner of the Romane Conti vineyard, right where the small circle was on the corner of the drawing. The letter explained that 82 of the Romane Conti vines had already been poisoned. According to the note, the 2 vines in the area marked on the sketch with the 2 X's had already been killed by the poison, and the other 80 were said that they could be spared with an antidote if the ransom was paid. This is when Aubert called the authorities. He did not call the local police. Burgundy is very small and full of gossips and competitors who might use this fact or fiction against his domain. Aubert could not afford this to be mishandled, so he called a senior police inspector he knew in Paris. Investigators arrived at the vineyard, and the 2 vines that were poisoned were removed. It was determined that they were most definitely dying. In good news, the other 80 vines on the map had been drilled, but were proved not to have been poisoned. The authorities believe that part may have been a bluff. Now, whoever was responsible knew exactly what they were doing. To produce the detailed sketch, the person or persons had to have been breaking onto the property for some time now. It also appears they knew a great deal about wine, as the second letter included sophisticating winemaking terms that the average person would not be familiar with. Then, there was the fact that they used the syringe to inject the poison. This was especially significant. Over the centuries, winemakers have used syringe-like techniques to inject liquid into soil or into the plant itself to save many vineyards from pests and diseases. Now this was being used to destroy them. On the advice of investigators, Aubert did not drop off the money. He was out of town during the time that they asked for the drop-off. Investigators told him they didn't want him to change his plans so everything would appear normal at the vineyard. On February 4th, he had his trusted employee, Jean-Charles Cuvier, deliver a note to the determined location in the dark of night. In the note, they said they would pay the ransom, but it would take some time to gather the euros, and they needed to have an emergency meeting with shareholders to arrange that level of sum. A few days later, a response came in what would be the third and final piece of correspondence. The tone of this letter was polite and described as quite friendly, even grateful that the payment would be made. It instructed Aubert to deliver the money in a bag to the cemetery of the neighboring town of Chambol-Musigny. The suitcase was to be left inside the cemetery gates at 11 p.m. on February 12, 2010. The week of the arranged drop-off, Jean-Charles Cuvier walked into the cemetery in the black of night, carrying a suitcase filled with 1 million fake euros and a tracking device that would be activated when the bag passed the sensor embedded in the threshold of the cemetery archway. There was about a dozen armed police officers hidden about the cemetery, watching him to ensure his safety. Cuvier was instructed to keep his phone near his ear, so a police officer would be in constant communication with him. Cuvier was very nervous. It was cold and dark. He dropped the bag in the designated space, a flower box just inside the gate, got into his car, and drove away. No more than 30 minutes later, he received a call from police. We got him. The caught man was Jacques Soltis. He was in his late 50s. He walked into the cemetery on foot, retrieved the bag, and walked away. He made it about 200 meters from the cemetery, heading to a nearby train station for his getaway. In the days that followed, the police learned so much more. The Dumont de Romanée-Conti had not been Soltis' only mark. He had simultaneously orchestrated a similar plot against several very highly regarded vineyards in the same tactic. The other vineyards, too, had lost specifically 2 of its vines to poisons. Soltis knew a lot about winemaking. When he was about 12 or 13 years old, his parents sent him to a boarding trade school that specialized in winemaking. According to the current principal, who still has Soltis' file, they said his parents were winemakers overseeing a modest vineyard, and that Soltis was a troublemaker from the start. He was expelled only months after starting the school for offenses including smoking, cursing, and staying up all night. Soltis went on from there to become a career criminal. He committed a string of armed robberies and even attempted a kidnapping. During one of the crimes, shots were exchanged with police, and Soltis ended up being hit in the chest. He was then sentenced to 20 years in prison. He served only a portion of that time, but over a decade, he came up with a plan to extort wealthy winemakers. Soltis had done a considerable amount of planning and preparation, building a makeshift shack deep in the woods atop a hill, overlooking all of the vineyards. In the shack, among other things, police found a sleeping bag, a sofa, a hot plate, a change of clothes, the clothes of a vineyard laborer, batteries, a headlamp, a cordless drill kit, syringes, and many bottles of the weed killer Roundup, plus a handgun. It was covered so well and hidden that investigators took a while to find it. This was all a very lofty plan, and Soltis couldn't have done it alone. He had mailed the package to Aubert's home because he had his son, Cedric, follow the winemaker to learn his personal address. Soltis had promised 300,000 euros to Cedric, and while his father was in prison, Cedric practiced in Bordeaux and Champagne drilling vines to be ready to execute the plan once his father was released from prison. In total, the 2 men damaged 1,500 vines before ever getting caught. Unlike his father, Cedric, according to sources, was in his late 20s or early 30s. He didn't have a criminal record, but was considered mentally fragile, and that's the verbiage that they used. He relied heavily on his father, and this allowed his father to manipulate him due to his disabilities. To show his thanks to investigators, when Aubert returned from his trip, he invited them to the Dumont and uncorked a few special bottles. To toast their work, this was a very special moment. In the weeks following the arrest, word of the crime leaked to the French press. Aubert began hoping that the whole matter could just be bottled up quietly. And yes, that pun was intended. They wanted to avoid a trial because, like I said before, they were worried that this would inspire copycat crimes. 5 months after the arrests, the prosecution's case against Jacques and Cedric Soltis became extremely difficult to pursue because in July 2010, Jacques turned up dead in a Dijon prison. According to prison officials, he had hung himself in the bathroom. The French legal system is unlike America's. Among the many differences, once a suspect is in custody, the matter is turned over to a judge. Like a one-person grand jury, this judge takes over the investigation, overseeing both the defense and prosecution, and the police, then decides whether official charges for formal accusations would be filed. Until a trial has begun, there are no public records for this case. No police reports are made public, not even mugshots. Defense attorneys can be fined or worse for speaking to the media. Officially, the only officer of the court empowered to discuss the Soltis matter was the district attorney of Dijon. It was said that Soltis left behind a suicide note, but in it, he did not, as some hoped he would do, absolve his son of responsibility in the scam. So he continued to be a dirtbag. And at this time, Cedric had been released from prison, but not cleared of charges. The district attorney hoped the judge would determine formal accusations against Cedric because he said Romanée-Conti is not only a Burgundian treasure, but a national one, and it is important for the government to send a message that such crimes would not be tolerated. In my opinion, this is fucking shitty, as he was following orders by his father, who masterminded the whole thing, and he was disabled. The top winemaker families all say that they have never seen a crime like this before. They said they were concerned, but would rather not discuss such a vulnerability. They quietly support Aubert's wishes that there would be no trial and no further talks of the Soltis and poisonings. The press director for the Association for Burgundy Winemakers said, "A Burgundy with fences and lights and patrolled by German shepherds? This is something I cannot imagine. This would not be Burgundy." According to law enforcement officials, when Cedric found out about his father's suicide, he sat in a chair, staring into space and looking lost. This same source said that while the judge may determine formal accusations may be warranted against Cedric Soltis, experts hired to determine the mental competency would likely declare that he was not fit to stand trial. However, the French courts did determine that Cedric was going to have to go to trial. Cedric was convicted and served 8 months in prison for his role in the extortion plot. Now, there's only one mystery left here. On the surveillance tape that the police obtained from the Paris post office, the person mailing the Soltis packages was not Jacques or Cedric, though it was unclear who exactly this person was. Perhaps it was simply someone who was asked to mail a few parcels, or perhaps not, but we will never know. Aubert de Villaine seems to have moved on. Ultimately, no other vines were harmed and the grounds have been preserved, so there is no impact on future harvests. Maximilian Potter, who first wrote about this story in Vanity Fair, then wrote a book called Shadows in the Vineyard. If you do want to learn more about this case, I would recommend giving that a read. He also told NPR's Scott Simon that he was lucky enough to have tasted the fabled Domon Romanée-Conti, and says, without being overly hyperbolic, it's definitely the finest flavor I've ever had in my mouth. I drank it and I was immediately filled with an incredible warmth. My sources were Vanity Fair, NPR, Wine Spectator, and the New York Post. Thank you all for listening to my case all by myself, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. If you do drink wine, then cheers. If you are not a drinker, then cheers to whatever is in your cup. We will be back next week together with some new stories for you all. Bye.